I guess, you're my age, Miles, and you were born in London in 1964. You were one of the first members of so-called Generation X. Who was your father and what did he do?
My father was Alan Aldridge. He was a renowned illustrator and art director. By the time he had me in 1964, he was already sort of like whiz kid art director for Penguin Books at a very young age. I think 23, 24, he was like running the art department. And so it was this kind of like combination of psychedelia or pre-psychedelia and eroticism that was, making Penguin Books for a moment an incredibly sort of like sexy thing, where of course for decades it'd been very like dusty, so my father came along as this kind of like, he was called the Beardsley and Blue Jeans of his generation as an art director. That was his beginnings. And then he went on to work with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who and Elton John. Me and my sister used to go sort of backstage with Elton John quite a lot and sort of saw all that madness, certainly through the late 60s into the 70s.
What did he do for the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Elton John? Did he design posters or what was he an illustrator for them?
His first connection with John Lennon was a book called The Penguin John Lennon, in which he art directed John Lennon as Superman and had a photographer photograph him, and that was the cover. But he did this bigger project with the Beatles, which is called The Beatles Illustrated Lyrics, which is a fantastic compendium of all of the Beatles lyrics. He art directed it and he illustrated probably 10% of it, so probably like 20 songs. And for Elton John, he did his album cover called Captain Fantastic.
Your father did the Captain Fantastic?
Yeah.
Amazing. I believe it was the first record to ever enter the charts at #1. No other record had done that before.
As an album, yeah.
As an album. But when you were 10, there was this thing, you call it this cataclysmic divorce that destroyed the family unit. What happened and how did this, I guess looking back now, form your aesthetic sensibility and influence your work, this kind of fissure that divided your parents?
My mum and dad, they met in their early 20s, fell in love and had me. And so it was a golden time. With my father's success, there's a price to pay. He was gregarious and sought after, and by all accounts, a very beautiful man. It was impossible to hold a family. Anyway, it's possible for him to hold a family together while being in the center of this zeitgeist. I heard about it in a very, as I say, cataclysmic way. I was listening to my mum on the phone, but I quickly understood, age 10, that my father had another family, and therefore that I had a brother that I had no idea about. Me understanding this over a phone call that I was overhearing with my mother in the next room was really the kind of like the beginning of this sort of the world falling apart.
I think that's such a Miles Aldridge photo in my mind. A woman in a kitchen on the phone, a little boy looking at her. There's no man in the picture, but the man is influencing the picture. It just seems like such a moment that whether you were aware of it or not, when you tell that story, I suddenly think about a number of your photographs. I want to just veer off just for a minute. And I know that at 13, punk rock entered your life. And at 16, you joined a garage band with roots in psychedelia called the X-Men. And you got a record deal and you recorded a John Peel session at the BBC. What did you plan? Were you guys serious about moving forward? I know this isn't really about your photography, but I'm just curious.
Punk rock arrived. I found it really an incredible sort of palliative to my anger, of my family. And I would go off on my own. I was always a very solitary kid. I don't know if that's just something that happens when you're in a divorce, probably not. But for me, when I think back on my childhood, my teens, I was nearly always going on my own to a punk gig and listening to, 999 or The Clash, The Stranglers, Adam and the Ants I used to go to religiously. It was kind of like a private world. I thought all my friends at school were just too square and boring. And then to your question, that led to me starting or joining a band called the X-Men, who were a fusion of punk and rockabilly. And there was quite a scene during that time in North London. There was a sort of more and more of these kind of bands growing. We were signed up by this guy called Alan McGee, who ended up being the big man at Creation Records. Yeah, we did a John Peel session, which was extraordinary. I left the band and I went to art school because I thought I actually have a talent for doing art, as it were, for drawing and painting and that kind of thing, and not for music.
But then you're inspired by Derek Jarman and his Super 8 films, and you become a pop video director. What was it first about Derek Jarman's work that prodded you in that direction as a young man?
I had sort of like fascinations and obsessions about being a film director from quite an early age. I still do, of course. I'm still a frustrated film director. Seeing Derek Jarman's films it felt like punk rock again in the way that they were so raw and so kind of like, it didn't need the studio, they didn't need anything. It was literally the man, the camera, and often Tilda Swinton in front of it. It was poetic, it was immediate, and it didn't feel like Hollywood. Of course, something I haven't mentioned, when my father and my mother divorced, my father moved to Los Angeles. You know, like a lot of British guys, he came to Los Angeles in the hope of making films in some way. Talk about the image of the telephone again. You know, he was the one waiting for the telephone to ring. You know, there was a lot of possible projects, and I have a great archive of letters and faxes from my father, and there's a theme that runs through them, which is, I'm waiting for this deal to sign off. It's looking good. I'm sorry I didn't get to your birthday because I had to be in Tokyo to discuss this project. No, it's really like a lesson to myself. And I sometimes when I reach out to this concept of maybe being a director myself or making a film, I'm reminded so much of my father's difficulties with that. Sort of pull myself back a little bit from that for a bit.
It hasn't changed.
Hasn't changed, no.
You're talking about your father said, well, that says exactly what's been going on the last year. So it is, it's such a tough business, and it's so frustrating, especially for an artist who is an independent artist, to accept the compromises of how the business works, that I think most people get turned off after a certain point because of just the lack of movement, of how stagnant it is and how slow the business moves. But you know, this is really the point where you start becoming a photographer, because at 28 you find yourself quite by accident becoming a fashion photographer. You get an agent and you're suddenly shooting covers for British Vogue and W. How did this happen?
I take a photograph of my girlfriend, and this photograph ends up in her portfolio. She goes to Vogue. Vogue asks her, who took the picture? And she says, my boyfriend. And they say, tell him to come and see us tomorrow. We want to meet him. You know, when I mentioned to my sister what had happened, my sister was a famous model already. She was like, well, of course, most photographers are idiots. I think what she meant was that it's not really that complicated to be a fashion photographer. And so I just kind of grasped this opportunity with both hands and kind of went for it. And yeah, as you point out, I got an agent pretty quickly, and was shooting the covers of W magazine and Vogue. And I was really like flavor of the month for a few years.
Well, for actually about 7 years, and there comes a time when you begin to question what you're doing. I mean, do you think you were at all influenced and found romantic the notion of the fashion photographer played by David Hemmings in the Antonioni movie Blow Up? First of all, if so, why? There also came a time at the end of the 7 years where you were questioning something. What were you questioning, and why? What was happening to you at the point?
Well, I fell into the fashion photography. This was the period of so-called grunge photography. I didn't have any real skills as a photographer, as far as I knew nothing about lighting. I guess I was very much like the David Hemmings character in Blow Up. What I did have going for me was this sort of like slightly, this fascination with the model in front of the camera, and this whole kind of dance between the photographer and the model with the camera in between, capturing these moments. I also played very loud music. There was an energy in my studios, which I think was probably new when I arrived in New York. And I remember Linda Evangelista coming to my studio and complaining about the noise that was coming from, she was next door with Steve Meisel. And then, as you say, I did start to question it, because at a certain point with all of this success, which was a kind of, you know, highly commercialized images, nearly always on a white background, girls laughing, smiling, falling over, jumping. I sort of asked myself the question, how come your favorite film is Blue Velvet, your favorite artist is Hieronymus Bosch, and you know, you like the poems of T.S. Eliot, let's say, dark stuff, and you're making this squeaky clean crap? It was pretty fast, actually. That the answer to that question was, well, go back to what you were doing at art school and design the pictures and start drawing storyboards and preparing ideas before you get to the studio.
What were the influences as a photographer? I mean, I know when people have talked about you, they've touched on, of course, Helmut Newton, Cindy Sherman, of course, Paul Outerbridge. And I was wondering if there were other photographers, American ones, that perhaps influenced you as well. I can see Richard Avedon a bit in your work. I can see Irving Penn, Eggleston, because of the colors. When you look back now, what were the influential photographers that spoke to you?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Avedon, of course, was always right up there as a sort of an example of a photographer who'd managed to balance great fashion work with great personal work. I mean, his project, The American West, it was really like a Bible for when the grunge photographers arrived. They would all admit to an incredible debt to Avedon's book of these incredible travelers and lost souls that he captured in his book, The American West. You know, he was able to fulfill like dreams, you know, Davima and the Elephant. I mean, what an amazing picture. It's an extraordinary bit of art direction, you know, to have this elephant rearing up with this woman dressed in Balenciaga, I believe. Avedon actually came to my studio once because I was working with Holly Mellon, who was one of the editors that he worked with a lot. He said something, I think it was so generous and kind, because I really had just started. Holly introduced Avedon to me, and Avedon said straight away, he said, "Oh, so you're Miles Aldridge," as if I was some... That's nice. It's such a sweet thing to do, and I'm sure that he didn't know who I was, but it was very, very generous and sweet like that. But yeah, Helmut Newton, you mentioned, I quite often compare Helmut Newton and Federico Fellini together in the way that when you look at their work, it's just so surprising how much they shared of themselves, you know, because it's really, they don't hold anything back. You feel it's so without editing.
Well, so in this exhibition, it isn't photographers you're referencing, but movie makers and film. And the influences are mostly cinematic. I mean, Hitchcock, Fellini, Douglas Sirk, Almodovar, Fassbender, Bergman, Visconti, Truffaut, Buñuel, Kubrick. When did film start speaking to you? I mean, it seems in your timeline when you were in your late teens, early 20s, rather than your childhood or early teens, when you really began to go to the cinema and have these movies sweep over you.
I started to take myself to some of the great cinema clubs in London, and there were two great ones. One was called The Everyman in Hampstead, and the other was the Scala in King's Cross. And they would regularly show double bills and treble bills of Pasolini, you know, Antonioni, Godard, Truffaut. And I would just sit in cinema in the dark, receiving these incredible images. Yeah, it really began as a love of cinema. But then when I had the opportunity to direct pop videos, I again returned to these cinemas in the hope that in this Godard film or this Truffaut film, I would find the idea for the pop video that I'm trying to pitch for. And so my film education kind of continued from there, in as much as I watched so many films, just trying to find an idea, find a way in.
So what were the filmmakers who influenced you the most when you look back at that time? Who were the favorites?
You know, Hitchcock's films have always stayed with me for their kind of like their stylization of human life, the way the most banal, everyday objects become so sinister. Think of that kind of like, there's that great scene in Notorious where Gregory Peck is bringing a glass of milk up to Ingrid Bergman. You know, it's this glowing glass of white milk. You never see milk so white in your life. I think it's his stylization of life that I find so kind of true in a way. And this is something I kind of go back to again and again with my own aesthetics, my own work, is that when creating a world, I find by stylizing, whether it's a kitchen or a bedroom, this doesn't stop it being believable. You believe the drama even more.
I think that is totally true, because I do think that, for example, the older I've gotten, the John Cassavetes improv movies seem even more artificial to me on some level than than Kubrick or Hitchcock or Antonioni. There's just something about cinema that renders movies to be not real. And so whenever someone says, "Oh, well, that movie wasn't realistic enough," or "I didn't really buy the realism," you kind of wonder, well, what are you talking about? They're not supposed to do that. And they're not supposed to be reflections of reality necessarily. And I think why Hitchcock is so powerful is that he ignored all of that and how to really manipulate an audience into a kind of total pleasure about being afraid. I don't know. I mean, I think the older I get, the more I begin to really appreciate Hitchcock in ways that I never have. And I do think there is really no, I mean, I know he's British, but he's considered an American director. Really, no one has those 4 films in a row like Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, The Birds. I mean, that's enough. You know, in this exhibition, I mean, there's Blue Velvet, there's The Wizard of Oz, there's A Passion of Joan of Arc, Vampiros Lesbos. The Hours, oddly enough, Stephen Daldry's adaptation of the Michael Cunningham novel, where people remember Nicole Kidman played Virginia Woolf, but you're more interested in the Julianne Moore character, the housewife. Dangerous Liaisons, Mommy Dearest, The Marriage of Maria Braun, A Woman Under the Influence, Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, Valley of the Dolls, a lot of movies about women. And sometimes it's a movie about women or a reference about women that I think, well, that's so odd that was what he was referencing. I mean, I think with Mommy Dearest, I would have thought that you would reference another Frank Perry movie, either Diary of a Mad Housewife or Played as It Lays. True, both very hard to find, but that seemed to be more in your general kind of aesthetic than, say, Mommy Dearest. Though Mommy Dearest does as well too, because it plays with artifice and it plays with an actress and living a kind of artificial life in order to get through her real one. But what is it? I mean, so many images about women and so few men in any of your images. Very rarely are there men standing around. They seem to be absent. But at the same time, as I said earlier, they do seem to be present. They seem to be, in a way, deciding what's going on with the woman. You know, It's a very interesting tension that's going on.
You know, I think the easy answer for that is that when my parents divorced, I was, left with my mother when my father moved to Los Angeles. And I watched this woman care for us and cook for us and all this stuff. But at the same time, there was this real sense of her kind of falling apart bit by bit, that, what had been broken in the divorce could never be put back together again.
Why do you think? Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, she did herself then have her own child, but she decided this new brother of mine would not see his father. Again, it's almost like a character from like a Hitchcock film, like Mrs. Danvers or someone. It's an incredible will to decide that, I think. And I don't know why she decided, and we never knew who this guy was. We never met him. It was a very peculiar time, and again, I was, 10, 11 years old, and my mother would say to me, there's a woman outside parked in a car and she's been there all day. Can you check if she's still there? And I would go out and look down the garden path, and sure enough, there was a woman in a car with a handbag on her lap, with sort of perfect Hitchcock hair. And I realized later this was actually, I assume, the wife of the man my mother then had this child with. My childhood went from playing with action men and coloring in books, and to suddenly being caught up in these weird melodramas, very intense, of the style of Douglas or Fassbinder, it's sort of these strange housewives or wives or mothers who have these, in a way, this secret life. And I think that's what I really took from my mother as well, was this idea that, whatever was bubbling up inside her, whether it was my father's infidelities and the brutality of the divorce, or this child with this unnamed man, everything on her face was completely like a geisha, almost like completely without expression. There was no sense of torment in it. I think it was this driving all of this angst and turmoil inside, but while keeping this kind of perfect face, that later, when I started to question my own work and go into my work and try and find my own personal stories, I started to kind of like find these similar characters on the screen, thinking particularly of Isabella Rossellini's character in Blue Velvet. Here's a mother who is tormented, has such a secret life. I mean, so many secrets. And that's how I felt about when I look back at my childhood, it's just so many secrets and like unspoken truths. And so when I stumble across these characters in films, again, like the Julianne Moore character in Stephen Daldry's The Hours, and there's a couple of lines in that film that just kill me. And it's when the Julianne Moore character says to her son, "We're baking a cake for Daddy to show him that we love him." And the son says, "Otherwise he won't know?" She says, "Yeah, that's right, he won't know." And it's like, oh my God, I never thought that making a cake could have so much cynicism stirred into the mix, if you get me. With that helped generate these images called this series called Homeworks, where we have a mother, making a cake. The cake is all about love, and it doesn't end well. The cake is destroyed. In a way, the cake becomes a metaphor for the family birthday cake. It just has the word happy, while she's sort of like plunging a carving knife into it, which reminds me of that great scene in Hitchcock's film Blackmail, where the female protagonist is, defend herself from a rape, grabs a bread knife and, shoves it into the assailant. With the brilliance of Hitchcock, he takes the mundanest subject, a loaf of bread and a bread knife, and makes it just like terrifying.
It's so funny. Sometimes I can locate the reference, and sometimes I need to be taken through it. Because when I first saw this image, I don't know how many years ago, I always connected it with a Brian De Palma movie called Sisters, where Margot Kidder, as a kind of like psychotic Siamese twin, whose boyfriend brings her a happy birthday cake. She has a giant butcher's knife, and then she stabs him to death because she's going through a break. But of course, when you lay it out here, yes, you can even see the knife that Isabella Rossellini is holding in Blue Velvet, and then the images from Blackmail, and you can kind of see it. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's so like iconic in a way that you can apply a lot of your own movie history to it, because that's what I first thought about. And that had nothing to do with this.
Probably my most famous image, this one, Homeworks number 3, with the woman lighting the cigarette off the stove, which was very much inspired by the scene in The Marriage of Maria Brown by Fassbinder. Almost like film noir face of this woman who is, again, in the way that I described my mother, holding so many secrets behind that perfect visage, bringing her face close to the flame, enticing danger, and there's this sort of sensuality oozing out of her body, but there's also this kind of like coldness in there as well that's sort of holding it together. In a way, this is, again, very much how, my mother is remembered to me as a sort of beautiful, sort of sexual woman as well. I mean, I remember as a young man being taken by my mother to, try on clothes at a department store. And of course, taken into the changing room with all these women undressing, age 7 or 8, I guess, and seeing your mother in underwear, in a bra and in stockings and in, changing her shoes. All of this is, stayed in there. It stayed in there as unfinished business, because the fact with my mother is that when I was in my mid-20s, she unfortunately passed away from cancer. So had she been alive now, I would have all these questions for her, and I would understand so much more, and I could get so much more from her. But because she passed away, she just left this gigantic void and this question about who was this woman, And so I think the work has been, so much of the work feels about reconstruction of this missing woman,
Which is what Vertigo is about.
It's another famous image of mine, I Only Want You to Love Me. There was many scenes in the family of, dinners and lunches and snacks thrown across the walls. And in a way, food was often used in my family arguments as a sort of, as a weapon, as a sort of a statement of anger. There is that great scene in Streetcar Named Desire where Brando suddenly clears the table in his own way.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, and he's like, do you want me to clear your plate too? It's just this kind of like brutal animal quality within suburban friendly place.
And yet the male figure isn't in the picture. The male figure is not in the picture.
That's right. I think if I was to imagine a man in the pictures, kind of like really enacting, it would become too, as we were saying earlier, too real. It's the stylization of it that I think creates the power of the image. And what's interesting as well, I find, is that so many of my collectors of my work are women, and they nearly always say the same thing to me when they have the work hanging in their homes. They say, I look at your photograph every day, and it makes me smile. But I'm seeing myself there in that picture.
But here it's also interesting that you reference A Clockwork Orange, and it also made me think a lot about Kubrick and the women in his movies. And I would have thought that you definitely would have been drawn to Lolita, or you would have been drawn to Barry Lyndon, especially Marissa Berenson, and how she seems to be like one of your characters in a way within the confines of that movie.
The Clockwork Orange interior of the kitchen of Alex's parents' house, it's just so zany and courageous and bold. It gave me the confidence to be not scared, to really almost have bad taste with the colors and put as many colors in there as I could squeeze. Even the kind of like chicken gravy as a brown mixed into all these colors. Can it work? Because as well as the influence of cinema and the various photographers we spoke about earlier, there is also, of course, the influence of painting in the work. And
yes.
I mentioned Francis Bacon earlier, but there's Matisse and Alex Katz. Like, that is something where I've really wanted to take the work as the work has matured, further and further into more and more color experiments, where it is almost to the verge of color overload. Something to mention, all the work in the exhibition is shot on film. Nothing is shot digitally. I'm inspired by all of these great Technicolor films, all of those Technicolor Hitchcock films, all those Douglas Sirk films, where the color is beyond reality. When you see a red bus in Hitchcock film, it's like, whoa, it's just, it's almost a piece of red paint driving across the screen.
Douglas Sirk the same way.
Yeah, Douglas Sirk the same way. And those guys, they weren't interested in reality. What was that great statement of Hitchcock? It's not a slice of life, it's a piece of cake. So, shooting on film has also kept me slightly associated with all of those great filmmakers, in as much as the colors I create are created through the chemistry of the film.
Yeah. Does anybody use photographs? Does anyone use actual film anymore?
I think it's very rare. Having said that, I think there is a small renaissance of young photographers who really are, in a way that the same as the kids that like to buy vinyl.
And the same with the kids who are filmmakers now. There's a lot of purists out there who want to use film.
Long may it continue. We were talking the other day when we spoke about that great cinema, in Los Angeles, the golf ball shaped one.
It's called the Cinerama Dome on Sunset Boulevard, which just recently was closed.
To go and see Apocalypse Now there with my dad is one of the highlights of my life, I would say.
It was one of the highlights of mine too, seeing it there. It was kind of a exclusive showing at that theater for about a month. And you had to buy tickets in advance. It was kind of like an event. You could buy tickets a week in advance. And so I went with my parents on a weekday because they thought the evening shows would be too crowded. And I believe it was in an August or September afternoon. And it really was just one of those. I think it has the biggest screen in the States, not an IMAX screen, but I think the biggest screen in the United States. And it's just seeing anything there when I was a child or a teenager, I haunted that theater a lot, was really kind of overwhelming. Even not particularly good movies, you could still just be enveloped by that world because of the largeness of that screen and that wall. And that to me seemed to be, the epitome of what movies were about. They really weren't for me. And I knew this, you mentioned that it was hard for you to understand how a teenager could relate to movies in such a way, but I did. And I kind of at an early age, I got the artifice thing. I also got how I like, low art compared to bourgeois art, and how low art could mingle with high art. And so I guess there was something about being a teenage moviegoer. I think Walker Percy kind of talks about this in his novel, The Moviegoer. A bit dreamy, a bit passive, a bit of a voyeur. You're not really tethered to the reality of the world in many ways. And so, I don't know, I think that's part of there was something in my personality that drew me to films in a way, unlike my peers. A lot of my peers just like to go to the movies, but I had become kind of obsessed, and I was almost living my life through them in many ways. And the other thing about movies is that they're all about secrets. Movies are about secrets. They're about things you shouldn't be seeing most of the time. And that also delights the voyeur. These are secret meetings between people, private conversations that should not be privy to 1,000 people in a theater. So there was always that tension for me going to see a movie to find answers to stuff.
I love that idea of that movies are about secrets. I think as a young man, when you're trying to find your identity, it's important to remember this is trying to find your identity without Instagram, without Facebook. You're trying to find your identity. You don't have anything but a mirror in your bedroom. Sitting in the dark cinema for 120 minutes, you're not just nobody. You are living vicariously through the protagonists. Storytelling saves us. We're saved from the boringness of our actual lives.
Which in many ways is why you go to the cinema, to lose yourself, to lose your identity. I mean, I often, being gay, it was very hard to locate my quote unquote identity in films when I was growing up and into my 20s. And so I think I was looking for something else rather than identification or identifying with the movie, that I wanted to see a different truth. It was more of a door rather than a mirror, as I think they should be, as I think all art should be. I don't think art should necessarily be a mirror. It should be a door that you go through. And I think too often now, people expect it to be a mirror, and they don't want to go through that door. And I think that's why we have all of these. Art is moving slowly in a more ideological equation where more people can seemingly identify with it and find it relatable in a way, rather than find it mysterious and having nothing really to do with their everyday lives. And I think that's something that's what I love about these photos, is really the intense artificiality of it. That's what's so powerful about it. And I think this kind of new realism that another generation's extolling is not nearly as interesting. And again, when we get to a picture like this, A Drop of Red 2, I had no idea when I first saw this. I saw this image a long, long time ago. It was one of the first images I saw of yours. I had no idea that you would connect it to, say, The Wizard of Oz. And of course, in The Wizard of Oz, in the color scheme, I can totally see a connection between your work and that. But in terms of that particular image, now it makes sense, but I would never have guessed that.
Yeah, The Wizard of Oz is always sort of there in the background in a way. It's such a remarkable film, isn't it? It just from such a strange place, so disturbing.
Watched it the other night. It was just on the other night. I think
really,
November, December, and I watched it, and I thought, God, I've seen this movie so many times, and I haven't seen it in maybe in about 15 years or 20 years. Remarkable. Even more remarkable now as a 57-year-old man watching it than I was as a frightened child, because that was one of the first movies I ever saw when I was about 5 or 6 on television, and it always terrified me.
It's scary, it's strange, it's musical, this is some kind of fable in there. And again, the truth of this image, A Drop of Red number 2, this bottle of ketchup fell off the tray as I was coming in to the living room, and it kind of, the bottle of ketchup wobbled and toppled off the tray, smashed onto the floor. But it was actually a plastic bottle of ketchup. And of course, the ketchup is, as you know, not this red. The ketchup is kind of like, it's a very dull red, really, in reality, ketchup. But this thing happened, and it kind of like, I thought, this is an interesting picture. I must take it to the studio and rebuild it and remake it in a kind of, extreme way. I often think that when I'm imagining a picture, it's like real life, as if it was a Hollywood musical. The ketchup is really red and the glass is really sharp. And in this way that it's kind of like, it can't just be real life. It has to have this element, which would be sort of like more like Eggleston. I mean, Eggleston, the brilliant colorist, would have, instead of thinking about this and taking it to a studio, would have just got his camera out and shot it on his own kitchen floor. But I, influenced by Fellini a lot, actually, really came to see this idea of rebuilding things, as Fellini did all the time. He rebuilt nearly everything at Cinecittà Film Studios in Rome, rather than, because he came from this neo-realist background from Rossellini. He used to assist Rossellini, of course. He then took all the ideas of neo-realism, but then kind of like placed them in a film studio and kind of gave them that sort of like film studio glamour.
Well, he did that in the 2 black and white films. In La Dolce Vita, he was moving toward that, and he was moving toward it definitely in 8.5. And then it was finally at Juliet of the Spirits where he decided to work in color. That was sort of like, in some ways, the decline of Fellini, but also he became a remarkable and even more remarkable image maker in so many ways. And the use of color in Juliet of the Spirits has got to be, along with Antonioni's, I guess, Red Desert, two of the most influential movies of that time in terms of their use of color and how color gives the audience so much subconscious or unconscious information.
It must be so interesting to think of the conversations Fellini would have had with his cameraman and his set designer on Juliet of the Spirits, having made these incredible black and white films. How do you make a color Fellini film? You know, he'd also made La Strada, of course, another black and white. Many Nights of Cabiria too.
Well, those were before the design for La Dolce Vita 8.5 really were moving him in a much more operatic style. I mean, I think La Dolce Vita is right in the middle of that, where the neorealism is slowly moving into the camera movements are more tracking shots, and he's entering into actually kind of moving from the lower middle class and the poor into the world with both La Dolce Vita and 8.5 and Juliet of the Spirits into the world of the wealthy.
Yes, and the bourgeois. And, you know, I often think of, particularly La Dolce Vita, I think of it as a kind of almost like Dante's Inferno, with this kind of like various circles of hell that Marcello witnesses as almost, you know, without being burnt himself. He's taken into the world of the glamorous movie starlets, you know, the aristocratic family. And there's this sort of various kind of like tableaus. Our guide, Marcello, takes us through, and we kind of like see the kind of the grotesqueness of modern bourgeois life. And of course, it ends with this incredible grotesque fish dragged from the depths in a net by these wonderful fishermen. And then it finally ends with this, as he describes her, as a Botticelli angel waving to him across a gully of seawater between them. And there's this wonderful, wonderful, brilliant moment where the Marcello character he indicates that he can't hear what she's saying because of the sound of the sea. There's a sort of wonderful, almost existentialist idea from Fellini of the lack of communication, the misunderstanding. Yeah, it's a perfect.
But it was very new for him because those really weren't the concerns of the early neorealist film. They were kind of about survival and getting by, whether it was La Strada or Nights of Cabiria or even I Vitalonia. I mean, it's sort of like something happened. And I do think that is the moment when he was making his greatest work. I like the neorealist films, but I like that period of La Dolce Vita and 8.5, where he was about to move into an even more kind of surreal realm, and really narrative stopped kind of interesting him to a degree. I mean, I think of everything past Juliet of the Spirits as some interest, but nothing really came together, I think, except for Armacord, which was his autobiographical. That seems to be, in the later period, the one really great movie he made. I can't think of any after 8.5. And it's sort of like, and he really did start making kind of an essay movie with like Satyricon or Roma. I know people who, I've never been able to get through Casanova, which he made in the mid-70s. It was with Donald Sutherland perversely cast as Casanova. and a lot of, but you know, still if he only made La Dolce Vita.
Absolutely. For me, Fellini is a god in as much as that he, you know, had this sort of incredible personal vision. But I think you're right in as much as that the films after 8.5 became so interested in the subconscious and his sort of like explorations of Jungian imagery that it kind of like, he lost that moment of, he lost that sort of having one foot in reality. And then, you know, we were talking earlier about, you know, Mummy Dearest. And to me, this is just such an incredible performance by Faye Dunaway with sort of like extraordinary rage.
Well, it also destroyed her career. I mean, this was the movie that, I mean, she goes so far in this movie and she's so daring as Joan Crawford. You know, I think it was Pauline Kael who said it almost approached the madness of kabuki theater. I mean, it was so stylized, and you know, it's so kind of overpowering that a lot of audiences, when they first saw this movie, laughed at it. They laughed at those scenes because I think in some way it was easier to process it that way because they were so uncomfortable, and this actress was so completely committed to this role and giving this performance. But again, I mean, I'm kind of seeing the connection. The film reference is Mommy Dearest, but then it looks like someone who's Elizabeth Taylor in a kind of 50s decor with a grapefruit that looks also kind of 50s. I don't know. What is the connection?
There's also sort of an element of Slim Aarons here. The great sort of like, documenter of the wealthy.
Very interesting documentary just came out about him that I recommend.
Here's that Fassbinder film, Fear of Fear, which was very much part of my thinking with this image, Chromo Thriller number 3. But inspired by Fassbinder's film, I set this shot up. This is all in a photo studio with an artificially built bathroom. I thought, I would just get the model to kind of like blow dry her hair, but before I started directing the model to blow dry her hair and that, I just took a shot of her holding the hairdryer up to her head, just so I could see how all the colors will work. I took a Polaroid, and then we started shooting, and as described, she started playing with her hair, and we got to a certain point, and I thought, I think we've got something here. I flicked through the Polaroids that I'd taken of her performance, and then I got to the one that I first shot, which was where she just held the hairdryer to her head for the test for the color. And I realized that I hadn't shot this on film. I realized that this was so much stronger, rather than like acting and trying to be playful with his hairdryer, just holding the hairdryer to her head, almost like a gun. That end scene in Taxi Driver where Robert De Niro holds his fingers to his temple.
When I see this photo, I mean, there's no way movies look like this. This is such a unique and specific world. I don't even know if I would want a movie to look like this. I mean,
very good point.
The artifice and everything, it really doesn't look like movies, and that is what actually makes it powerful. I mean, most movies don't look like this in terms of their, the artificiality and the colors. Even the most stylized movies don't. So just something that I was thinking of when you were mentioning the other films like Taxi Driver. Certainly a stylized film on many levels, but nothing looks like these.
I'm quite often asked, because I talk about cinema and my film references all the time in interviews, there's often comes up, do you have a plan to direct a film? And I always think, well, I would love to, but the problem is, because I have all this influence of cinema into my photographs, if I then put all this influence of cinema into a film, then it's just another film, if that makes sense. I think what's interesting about the work is that it's taking one medium, cinema, and putting that into photography.
I think you should do it anyway.
Yes, it definitely needs to be done.
I think you should make a movie anyway.
Yeah. Well, if anyone's listening, they want to do that, let's do it. Would love to. But I take your point, and it does give me pause to think as well when I don't know any films that look like this. I'm not sure I want a film to look like this.
Yeah.
It gets tiring, doesn't it? It gets very draining. There are films that attempt stylization in this way. I think they prevent you from going into the story in some way. I assume you know this film reference very well.
I do, but yet there's a child here and there's a balloon. I know exactly where this is. It's from the Carol Reed's The Third Man, the very famous final shot of the film. But just look, I might have vaguely recognized the background, but then the woman and what she's wearing, the child and the balloon, I would not have thought about it. I would have thought about something else.
Again, I think this goes back to that system I have taken a personal memory, going for a walk with my mum, for example, but then seeing it through the gauze or the filter of cinema, The Third Man. It's like remembering that kind of walk in a park. Of course, it would have been a park in London, not this park, which is in Paris, from my memory. But this. I mean, I should just say this scene in The Third Man kills me every time. This idea, that long take of this woman that he's in love with walking towards him, and she just walks straight past him. It's just fantastic every time. every time I watch it, I get such a thrill. I almost think this time maybe she'll stop, but of course she just sits like hours straight past him.
Robert Altman does a great reference to this last shot in the end of The Long Goodbye, which is his masterpiece from 1973. And it does a riff on this at the very end after Elliot Gould has killed the criminal and he's walking by, and the woman who's used him is driving by in a Jeep, played by Nina Van Pallen. It's a total reference to this, and it's also that knocks me out every time I see it.
For me, this idea was based on these children who end up being the carers for their parents, in the way that the parent is so sort of like, you know, whether it's drugs or alcohol, they're incapable of looking after themselves, and the child ends up being the adult. And that was the sort of, I think I read a piece about that in the New York Times, and I sort of started to design this story, these images about this child who's looking after the mother, and that's why the mother's holding the balloon. The mother is childish.
Again, I have to say, it's so interesting when it comes down to particular filmmakers and the movies that you reference from them, because I always thought that with Truffaut, you would have referenced, I don't know, Two English Girls, or The Story of Adele H, or Jacqueline Bisset in Day for Night. And yet here is The 400 Blows. I mean, the mother in that movie is powerful, but it really is all about Antoine Loud. I mean, it's all about the kid.
Yes.
So it's very interesting that this is where your reference is from that particular Truffaut film.
Well, I love in that film, 400 Blows, the activity of the children. They're sort of always running across the road and the lights are green, kicking footballs, you know, graffitiing. You know, the kids are like a sort of a endless, sort of like, you know, almost like a bacteria. They like filling the streets of Paris with their energy, these kids. My son is actually one of the kids playing football in this. The idea came to me not only through the Truffaut film, of course, but through being a father, taking my son to Saturday football class and watching various parents, including very well-dressed and high-heeled and well-turned-out mums, picking up their children from soccer practice. Like a lot of my work, the genesis of the work is an observed or seen or a memory. And then it is sort of like, you know, how many films can I reference to kind of build this picture? Another scene of strange motherhood, you know, from here to maternity, shot at Santa Monica, I believe. Yeah, absolutely. Very much inspired by the kind of extreme female characters in Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. This was a project I shot for the New York Times, and I asked the hairdresser and the makeup artist to come to my hotel room before we met with the stylist. I played 20 minutes of Faster Pussycat Kill Kill Kill, and I said, between you and me, between us three, I want us to create this woman, this kind of like real Amazonian, strange mother from, you know, hell in a way. You know, it's really weird creation with these strange children. But let's not tell the editor from the New York Times that's what we're doing. And it worked, you know. She's also like a kind of bizarre birth of Venus in a way. Yeah.
And also it references the beach scene from Juliet of the Spirits, I guess.
Yes, I love that scene on the beach.
That's the best scene in the movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, possibly because it's a real sea rather than, you know, built in Cinecittà. You know, this image, you know, the vagaries of fashion. It's a sort of like very sort of like severe mother that you might see in Mummy Dearest or Ingmar Bergman's film The Silence, with this strange relationship between the mother and the children. You know, not always warm, very often cold.
Well, like most of your photos, I mean, the power might be coming from the fact that there isn't warmth.
Yes, I think there's some truth to that, and you know,
which is not a bad thing at all. I mean, which is a powerful thing. I mean, or the warmth comes from the brightness of the colors and how expressive they are. But more, I mean, you rarely see anyone smiling.
That's right.
Having a good time in your work.
No, that's right. But, you know, I have an idea about that. As I struggle very hard to make photography a serious thing. And I think when people laugh or people, you know, are kind of, in a way, alive, doing things, that it really becomes focused on this idea of the moment rather than, what I love about images is this sort of sense of eternity of like, this image, for example, the mannequin Thriller #1, where she seems to be permanently frozen at this window. And that's it's that power of the image to not have a beginning, a middle, and ending like films have to have. That the image is complete, it's a complete universe in the way that, a Piero della Francesca painting, you don't feel that the characters in the painting were doing something before or they're doing something after. It's like they are permanently there, being baptized possibly, or what have you, depending on the image. Does that make sense in any way?
Yes, it does.
I love these references from Double Indemnity, where
an unforgettable supermarket in 1944. If you want to see what a supermarket looked like in 1944, this is really remarkable.
It's great, isn't it? And I love the whole stylized way of the way they act together. Like, they're meant to not know each other, and they're kind of like talking amongst the cans of pineapple and tomatoes and so forth. Yes. It's Andy Warhol, pre-Andy Warhol. I mean, this is just Campbell's soup cans galore. Such a great reference. And of course, the Stepford Wives is the great supermarket film.
Well, it's also interesting that you kind of dress them correctly in your version. There was a lot of problems that William Goldman, the screenwriter of that movie, had, because Brian Forbes, I think his wife, Nanette Newman, her wives, and he did not want her to dress the way Ira Levin, who wrote the novel, and William Goldman, who wrote the screenplay, wanted them to dress, because the men in this, the city of Stepford, the town of Stepford, are actually recreating engineered versions of their wives that have much larger breasts, that are much more docile, but also much more beautiful. And it's so strange that Brian Forbes made the decision to dress them in the movie with these very long sundresses, hiding their hips and their legs. And there's a little bit of cleavage and these hats, but that was not the way they were supposed to be. Yours is much more like what they were supposed to be, without you probably knowing that. And it's so interesting to see, because I've seen the movie The Stepford Wives many times, but it's like seeing these images now, it just brought me back to that whole style.
And then there are these religious images called Immaculée, which were very inspired by the great Black Narcissus film by Powell and Pressburger. Yes. Sort of demented nun who, is sort of on a kind of journey from the sacred to the profane. I love that scene when she puts on the red lipstick and becomes, sort of, eroticized, I guess, for one word. Such a great film. And of course, regardless of the story and the brilliance of the story, Jack Cardiff's incredible cinematography using, early Technicolor process is just so inspiring. Again, plays into this whole subject of the stylization of the image, the use of strong gelled lights, reds and oranges, and fake painted skies and sets. I've rather like the Wizard of Oz, it's this incredible orgy of color. And isn't it interesting again to think that, as you were saying about my print chromo thriller with the hairdryer, you're not sure you want to see a film that looks like that. But in a way, there are, these early Technicolor films strangely do look like that in a way. There's this they're so sort of unreal and so lit. The film stock was so insensitive then, it needed an incredible amount of light to expose an image on it. And so, there was no chance to light it just with the ambient everyday light. Now, of course, cinema now, you can make a film, with a 60-watt light bulb, but I think the films I really respond to are where there is light used in in an expressive way to describe the features, to describe what's happening, describe the background. Everything is lit, you know. I think that's what's telling about, you know, so much contemporary cinema that I find hard to, you know, get excited about. Though of course I can get excited about the story. I mean, I watched Minari the other day, and I thought it was absolutely, you know, beautiful. I fell into the spell of it. But you know, films that I can get a visual excitement from.
Rare.
Yeah, rare.
Very rare. Minari is not one of those movies.
No, not at all.
Minari is something, a small scale indie family drama about people we really haven't seen before. But no, it's not a visually exciting movie. But you're right, there are movies that kind of look like your stuff, and certainly someone could point to Vertigo. Vertigo certainly has that kind of, or you could even say Pillow Talk, which also has an amazing visual pop late 50s style to it. So, you know, but there's a lot, but that one's a thriller, one's a romantic comedy. I don't know. They're not. Blue Velvet.
Yeah.
So there are.
Yeah, those roses on that picket fence, absolutely. Yeah. You know, we're here at the Immaculée series, and you know, in some of the images, the Carl Dreyer's The Passion of Joan Arc was really a great reference. The you know, the sort of the closeness of the camera, and you know, those tears, the sort of endless sort of tears of Falconetti. Yeah. I mean, I don't think my photographs get close to the performance, of course, but you know, this is a different medium. I think, you know, Falconetti's performance as Joan of Arc is endlessly in turmoil. It's kind of like it's almost like a piece of performance art, you know. Yes. And this talk about stylization. I mean, the stylization of this 1928 story of Joan of Arc is extreme. I mean, it's bordering on, you know, the sort of the white backgrounds of Richard Avedon. It's right. So simplistic and so sinister. I don't know if you remember those sort of like turning wheels, which represent the torture machines. And
yes,
this image 3D has become a really sort of iconic image for my work. And of course, you know, we're here talking about the influences of cinema, and here is an image of a young lady sipping a Coca-Cola and eating her popcorn, to all intents and purposes staring up at the silver screen. The reference to 3D cinema was made through using the Coca-Cola and the popcorn as sort of cut out two-dimensional objects, in as much as that her experience in the cinema of, you know, eating and drinking was very flat 2D versus her 3D experience of the screen. But, you know, when thinking about a woman in the cinema, it's very hard not to think about, you know, the great scene in Amarcord, where, you know, this is the fantasy of the young boy moving closer and closer to the lone woman smoking a cigarette in the cinema. You know, I also recently rewatched Midnight Cowboy, which again has that just heartbreaking scene in the 42nd Street cinema, where Joe Buck is forced to turn a trick in order to sort of sustain his life in unfriendly New York. What a film! The
trick doesn't have the money.
The guy doesn't have the money. I know, the nerve of the guy. The nerve of the guy. You know, Schlesinger is such an interesting director. You know, you think of his work, Far from the Madding Crowd, Darling, and this. I mean, those are three great films.
But you know what? I think he made his masterpiece after this. I think Sunday Bloody Sunday is Schlesinger's great film.
Oh, really? I need to rewatch it. It's not on my top 100 at all.
It really is. It has aged so beautifully, because I've seen it many times throughout my life. And I do think that sometimes Schlesinger can go for over editorializing in his films. And I think there's sometimes that New York is shot from really not an American viewpoint, but from an Englishman who is suddenly drop there, and he's seeing things that perhaps we haven't seen or we take for granted. And I do think there's a little bit of editorializing going on in some of the scenes in Midnight Cowboy, even though I think it's a really good film. I think the same thing with Darling to a degree, and there's a level of satirical impulse that he can't hold back on. And finally, when he gets to Sunday Bloody Sunday, it's just pure drama comedy, and it really is the fullest. It's the moment where everything comes together for him, and then everything kind of falls apart afterwards. So Sunday Bloody Sunday, 1971, Glenda Jackson, Peter Finch, terrific movie.
I have seen it, and I need to rewatch it, so it'll be on.
All right. Well, look, keep me posted on all this. And I don't know if anyone's traveling. I mean, if you're ever in town, always give me a heads up if you come to
Absolutely.
LA.
Absolutely.
And keep me posted on everything that's going on with this photographiskia.
Yeah. If you find yourself in New York,
I'm not ever going to New York in the rest of my life.
Fine. Okay. Well, I'll see you in Los Angeles.
Yes, if you're out there, or conversely in London.
I hope to be out there soon. Yeah, I feel ready to fly and travel and get back to my job. Great. Well, look, thank you again.
Thank you, Miles. It was a great time.
All right, friend. Thank you so much. Lots of love. Bye-bye.